Hello, everyone. My name is Logan, and I am a part of Group 5, and I will be covering the topic of qualia, which is the subjective sense perception, also known as the philosophy of mind, and defined as individual instances of subjective and conscious experience. What's interesting about qualia is that there's kind of two parts to it. There's more of a neuro physiological side and then a philosophical side that you really need both to understand the whole problem that qualia brings to the scientific community. One quote that I was very particularly interested in was Ramachandran's "Why is thought, being a secretion of the brain, more wonderful than gravity, a property of matter?" So let's just see here. What is qualia? Like I mentioned before, it's individual instances of subjective and conscious experience. It's not so much an explanation of an experience, but the actual sensation of the experience from a first person view. It's more of the I view versus the he or it view, and tends to be one of the most important and unsolved problems in science, mainly because of the objective versus subjective viewpoints that you can study it from. There's what it is like states of consciousness, which is feeling pain, seeing red, smelling a rose, etc. These are all examples of qualia because they are subjective to you, but to a third party, it would be only accessible to them by you telling them what it's like to experience. And like I said before, it's somewhat of a neurological and philosophical problem because we both have the processing that happens in our brain with getting our sensory information from the environment, and then also the philosophical problem of having to really see what subjective consciousness is and how we can communicate that with other people. One important thing to distinguish what qualia is that Ramachandran described it to have three characteristics. One is irrevocable, which means it cannot be changed. This was a good example in the book. If you remember the picture of the Dalmatian dog, once you saw the ink blots and you saw that it was an outline of the dog, you were unable to unsee it. So it's tamper resistant. Neurons in the brain permanently alter their connections once you saw the dog. The second would be having flexibility of choice. This would be, for instance, seeing yellow. One person may subjectively see the color yellow and think of such things as a banana or yellow teeth or anything. So as long as you have a multitude of options to think of, then it would be defined as qualia. And the very last one, the third, would be that it would be stored in short-term memory, which was described by Ramachandran to be holding information in sort of a buffer zone in the brain to be used in subconscious experience. First, I want to tackle the philosophical implications of qualia, and then we'll get more to the neuro side of it. A couple of arguments that are important in the study of qualia early on and definitely still important today would be that of Thomas Nagel, and he had the popular story of what it is like to be a bat. Which is basically the subjective aspect of the mind may not ever be sufficiently accounted for by the objective methods of science. Basically meaning that if we were to wonder what it is like to be a bat, there would really be no scientific way to actually describe that. I'm sure we could plug ourselves into like a VR per se and fly around and be a bat, but there would never be any sufficiently accounted information to subjectively be in the bat's position, which poses a great problem for objective methods of science. The second, and my favorite, John Locke, being a philosophy nut, came up with the inverted spectrum argument, which was an example that he would use to show what would it be like if you woke up one day and every object was a different color than perceived before. This is sort of to show that if there's no damage to the brain, then this qualia must be a change in property that determines the way things look to us, has no physical basis. So qualia is purely subjective and may not have any physical attributing to it, such as our brain chemistry. It could be completely independent. So subjective thought could be something that's more of a automatic thing than a process of neural processes in your brain. The third would be a zombie argument, which there's no such thing as consciousness because quail is separate from the physical brain. So this may be true. We have yet to detect any physical trace of qualia besides the series of neurological events that lead up to the event of subjective consciousness. So even though we're able to study the brain and how that sensory information makes it to our brain, we're still unable objectively to really tell how that information is perceived subjectively. Only in a third person are we able to do that. So that was the philosophical implications of qualia. Let's go over the neurological side of it, which focuses more on the physical things that we can measure and detect with objective science. We know that qualia resides and originates from parts of the temporal lobe. These are mainly parts such as the amygdala, hypothalamus, and insular cortex, which we know control internal functions and our other big sensory and processing areas of our brain. These are lower layers of the primary sensory areas that eventually make their way into the frontal lobe for executive functioning. So that's why we think qualia originates from the sensory and then moves its way up to the frontal area for subjective consciousness. Qualia could be also the realization of a long string of neurological events, like I just described. This is sort of like the zombie argument in the philosophical side. This is an argument that qualia could be just our own subjective realization of the process that happens neurologically from stimuli to subjective experience itself. We also have another argument here in the neurological side of qualia. Rodolfo made an argument that qualia can be turned off. He said that even though the brain can have anesthesia and be put out of consciousness, he was still able to stimulate limbs by using the patellar reflex or using electroshock on the brain to stimulate certain areas of the motor cortex to make patients move. And he said that this proves that you can change the variable of neuronal oscillation and that qualia must reside physically as a process in the brain. This kind of ties into the Charles Bonnet syndrome, which we talked about in the book here, in Ramachandra's book. This has to do with damage to the retina or optic nerve, usually of patients, producing blindness in either large portions or in the entire visual field. But instead of seeing nothing, they usually experience vivid hallucinations. And this overall suggests that vision is not a one-way cascade of processes like we thought it was in the brain, that the primary visual cortex also has a great deal of memory storage and sensory info when we just imagine certain objects, say for instance like a rose. So this really gives some great information on how subjective experience can be located in certain areas of our brain. Let's move on to new findings in research that give more rise to what we know about qualia neurologically. We have the neural correlates of consciousness, which sort of map out the neural pathways and processes that lead to subjective consciousness. Here we have, without some brain structures, consciousness would not be possible. They originate from the reticular formation of the brainstem, and are projected through neurons in the nucleus of the thalamus into the cerebral cortex. We also have data obtained recently that indicate that dopaminergic neurons located in the nucleus accumbens are involved in the regulation of consciousness and also sleep. And lastly, we have the cortical and subcortical explanation for consciousness, which states the posterior hot zone of the cortex, which includes the sensory cortical areas in the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe, are all responsible for our consciousness and a rise of qualia. Lastly, a great body of recent research that is thought to be important in the understanding of qualia has been thought experiments. This one done by Christopher Searle. It is a scenario where there are two brains. One brain is a fully functioning human brain in a vat, and the other one is a brain that has been cut up into many pieces and scattered across a room, but it has been hooked up into a supercomputer that feeds it the same exact sensory information the brain in the vat has. So each brain is getting the same sensory information that the other is getting, and both are having the same stream of consciousness, unaware that each brain is in a vat or receiving information to a computer. And his explanation for this and basic overall question is if each brain is getting stimuli in different ways and processing it, one organically and one through a computer, are the qualia different for each brain, or are they the same? So something interesting to think about, what really defines our subjective experience and qualia here. Overall, I think qualia needs more studying with the neurological side, and really how we're going to go forward and objectively measure what subjective consciousness truly is. Thank you.